It's time now for our focus report. More than 2 weeks ago, Hurricane Maria made landfall on the US island of Puerto Rico. It left a path of devastation in its wake. Roofs were ripped from buildings and rising waters turned streets into rivers. The country's energy grid was all but destroyed. The sheer extent of the destruction and mounting accusations that Washington wasn't doing enough to help prompted US President Donald Trump to visit the island. He promised financial and material aid, and it's much needed. Our correspondent Gallagher Fenwick went to visit some of the areas worst affected by the hurricane to see how Puerto Ricans are coping with Maria's aftermath.
More than 2 weeks after making landfall on these parts, Hurricane Maria continues to have a crippling effect on much of Puerto Rico. In his 20 years of working here as a lifeguard, Ryan Rodriguez tells us he had never seen anything like it. Relentless and powerful winds uprooted trees and forced them into some of the cabins closest to the water. It also ripped roofs off the small structures.
Looks like it came and just swapped it up, took everything out. That's the refrigerator of the kitchen, stovetop, everything, benches. It's been very strong. I believe we had winds of 200 miles per hour to do this, basically.
Like many of his colleagues who were previously paid to keep an eye on beachgoers, Ryan has converted into being a full-time handyman at the resort that employs him. Bringing this workplace back to life will take huge efforts and quite some time, as is the case for the rest of the island.
Right now in Puerto Rico, I think we only have 5% with electricity, so that means that we've been here for already 2 weeks of the storm. So if you multiply that, maybe we're talking about maybe at least 6 months, 50%, maybe 8 months, 75, and like I think a year for the 100% for people who have electricity here.
In this southeastern city, local authorities are still working on clearing debris. Broken concrete and twisted metal are another indication of how mighty Maria was. In many of these homes, residents are ready to declare a complete loss.
I'm taking out everything that got soaked or damaged. Basically, I've lost everything. Everything.
This man tearfully explains to us that he has no choice but to move elsewhere. The situation is not much better in the mountainous areas. Basic commodities are hard to come by. Nonetheless, some choose to hold their head up high.
You can't just sit by and wait. You have to get on your feet and take charge of the situation. For instance, I told you about the woman whose window got broken. Well, we went there and fixed it ourselves. We didn't wait for the government to do it. Anyway, you can't rely on the government because they've already got so much to do.
This young man wants to show us the ingenious ways that he and his father have come up with in order to make the best of these tough times. Car batteries are regularly charged and used inside the home to power household appliances, but also vital equipment, such as the electric chair that the mother uses to recline and ease some of the pressure off her sick legs. Despite its resilience, this family's isolation makes it all the more difficult for it to find medication and to consistently run the machines that the mother is entirely dependent on for her well-being.
You insert the tube in the back, then you put the mask on, then the machine pumps oxygen into your lungs.
In Puerto Rico these days, everyone, including the island's many cell phone users, has to be resourceful. Cars parked on the side of the road near one of the few cell phone towers still standing have become a common occurrence. For many, it's the only place where there is reception.
I'm supposed to have 3G signal around here, The other day, I spent 2 hours in my car talking on my phone with an airline. I was planning a trip for November. I had my kids with me. We were sitting with the air conditioning on. That's just the way it is now.
In some cases, Hurricane Maria has set locals back by decades, forcing them to return to the ways of a bygone era. The natural disaster dealt a severe blow to the economy of an already heavily indebted island.
Gallagher Fenwick reporting there. Well, for more on the situation in Puerto Rico post-Maria, I'm joined now by Audrey Celestine, who is a senior politics lecturer at the University of Lille. Thank you very much for joining us. We saw just there the extent of the destruction of Puerto Rico. How does the situation on the island over 2 weeks after Maria compare to places like Texas and Florida after hurricanes Harvey and Irma?
I mean, one of the big differences between Puerto Rico and these two states is the fact that Puerto Rico is an island, which means that in order to get emergency relief and to get people to actually help on the ground, it's much more difficult in terms of access because it's an island. There's also the fact that there was probably a sort of a fatigue in the news regarding the fact that several places had been hit by hurricanes and also the fact that a lot of people in the U.S. were not really aware that Puerto Rico is actually an American territory and that Puerto Ricans are fellow citizens. And that was actually one of the reasons why a number of people weren't that ready or to actually get some help to the territory.
Now, there's been a rather vicious war of words between the mayor of San Juan and US President Donald Trump in recent weeks. Is the mayor right to say that Washington hasn't been doing enough to help the island out?
I think that she was facing a very dire situation, a situation that was very difficult. They felt that they were being left by the federal government, and the reaction on part of Donald Trump was actually pretty similar to the kind of reactions you could have at the beginning of the 20th century when Puerto Rico became an American territory, in the sense that he would talk about the fact that they were not able to manage a situation on their own, that they were counting on the help of other people to come and help them. And that's the kind of words that were actually being used at the beginning of the colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the U.S. One point that actually Trump made, and that's pretty accurate, is the fact that a number of problems in Puerto Rico pre-existed, that the situation has been very difficult in the last decade with the financial and economic crisis. But the difficult situation is actually largely connected to the kind of post-colonial relationship between the island and the U.S. mainland, and also the fact that clearly there are no it's very difficult for Puerto Rican political leaders to actually lobby the federal government to get things done. So the governor of Puerto Rico had to lobby Washington during about a week to waive the Jones Act and to allow some relief to get to the U.S., relief on non-U.S. ships. And a number of things like that, for people who study the history of the relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, sounded very familiar.
And why do you think, I think we got a bit of a sense of it there, but why do you think it took US President Donald Trump quite so long to visit the island?
I mean, it's a difficult question. I think I'd say that maybe he cared a little less, but there's also the fact that the pressure on Washington was a little less important. When you look at Texas and Florida, those are two big states, lots of electors, representatives in Washington that are able to actually pressure the federal government and say, oh, you have to come down here and you have to make sure that people see that you're doing something for us. Puerto Rico is in no situation to actually pressure Washington like this because they don't have representatives. They have a non-voting representative in Congress, and people care less because they don't know that it's an American territory and that those are fellow citizens. So I think that's one of the main reasons why it took him so long.
And what do you think about the way Trump conducted his visit? He was, of course, seen distributing paper towels like they were baseballs. How do you think that visit went down?
Well, for a number of, media, than journalists. This visit was a sort of political catastrophe because it was, I mean, all of the images were, the fact that he compared, he draws this like very misleading comparison between Katrina and Maria in Puerto Rico was kind of weird. Especially because Katrina was a very, very good case of mismanagement in terms of federal public policy and emergency relief. So I'm not sure. It was important that he went because people saw that the president was actually coming down to Puerto Rico, but then I'm not sure it had such positive effects.
Audrey Celestine, a senior politics lecturer at Lille University here in France, thank you very much for speaking to us here on France 24.
Thank you.